In the year 1260, the world lived under a shadow that seemed impossible to escape. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, the Mongol Empire had surged outward with terrifying speed, leaving behind a trail of shattered kingdoms and burning cities. They did not simply conquer, they erased. Armies that stood against them were annihilated, rulers were humiliated or executed, and entire civilizations collapsed in their wake. From China to Eastern Europe, their dominance felt less like war and more like fate. What made the Mongols truly unstoppable wasn't just their mastery of warfare, but the fear that arrived long before they did. Stories traveled faster than their horses, stories of cities wiped from existence, of skies darkened by arrows, of mercy treated as weakness. By the time their armies appeared on the horizon, most enemies were already defeated in their minds. Resistance wasn't just dangerous, it felt pointless. That illusion reached its peak in 1258, when Baghdad, the beating heart of the Islamic world, fell in a matter of days. For over 5 centuries, it had stood as a symbol of knowledge, power, and faith. Then, almost overnight, it was gone. Its libraries burned, its people slaughtered, its legacy trampled into the dust. If Baghdad could fall, what hope did anyone else have? By then, one truth seemed undeniable: the Mongols could not be stopped. They were no longer just an empire, they had become a myth of invincibility. While the rest of the world was still reeling from the shock of Mongol destruction, one power remained unbroken: Egypt. But this was not a traditional kingdom led by noble bloodlines or ancient dynasties. It was ruled by something far more unusual and, in many ways, far more dangerous: the Mamluks. The Mamluks were not born into power. They were bought into it. Taken as young boys from the steppes of Central Asia or the mountains of the Caucasus, they were sold into slavery, stripped of their past, and rebuilt from the ground up. They were trained relentlessly, physically, mentally, and strategically, until war was no longer something they did, but something they were. Over time, these former slaves rose through the ranks, earning their freedom and ultimately seizing control of Egypt itself. What emerged was not just an army, but a system built entirely on discipline, merit, and survival. Every man had already lost everything once. They had nothing left to fear. At the center of this rising power stood Sultan Qutuz, a leader shaped by the very enemy he now faced. As a young man, he had been captured by the Mongols during their westward expansion. He had witnessed their methods, their brutality, and more importantly, their mindset. He understood something that few others did. The Mongols did not just win battles with weapons, they won with fear. Their reputation was their greatest weapon, and once that fear took hold, resistance collapsed before the first arrow was even fired. But Qutuz refused to let that fear take root in Egypt. When news arrived that a Mongol force, led by the seasoned general Kitbuka, had advanced into the Levant and was now threatening the borders of Egypt, the message was clear: submit or be destroyed. This was the same ultimatum that had broken empires before them. Cities had surrendered without a fight, hoping to avoid annihilation. It had never worked. Qutuz made a different choice. Instead of replying with diplomacy, he answered with defiance. The Mongol envoys who carried the demand were executed, their heads displayed at the gates of Cairo. It was a calculated risk, and everyone in the city understood the consequences. There would be no negotiation, no compromise. This was a declaration of total war. And yet, something remarkable happened. Instead of panic, Egypt prepared. From Cairo to Alexandria, from the Nile Delta to the desert frontiers, soldiers began to gather. Cavalry units assembled, archers readied their bows, and commanders coordinated what would become one of the most important military responses in history. But this was not just about numbers, it was about mindset. Qutuz knew that defeating the Mongols required more than strength. It required breaking the psychological hold they had over every opponent they had ever faced. So he spoke to his men not as a distant ruler, but as one of them. He reminded them of what they had endured, of what they had become, and of what was at stake. This was not just another battle, it was a line in the sand. If they failed, Egypt would fall, just like Baghdad. If they stood their ground, they had a chance to do something no one had done before. They could prove the Mongols were not invincible. As the army marched out across the Sinai Peninsula toward Palestine, there was no illusion about what lay ahead. They were walking toward an enemy that had never truly been defeated. But for the first time in decades, that enemy was about to face something new, not just resistance, but a force that understood them, studied them, and was ready to turn their own tactics against them. The stage was set for a confrontation that would decide far more than territory. It would decide whether fear would continue to rule the world, or finally be broken. By the time both armies moved toward confrontation, the battlefield had already begun to shape the outcome. Ain Jalut, known as the Spring of Goliath, was not an open plain where speed alone could decide the day. It was a narrow valley in northern Palestine, framed by low ridges and broken terrain that forced movement into confined channels. To most commanders, it might have seemed like just another stretch of land. But to those who understood war at a deeper level, it was something else entirely. A place where control, not chaos, would determine victory. The Mamluks arrived first, and they studied the ground carefully. Every ridge, every slope, every narrow pass became part of a larger design. This was not an army improvising on the field. It was an army preparing to execute a plan. Their forces, estimated between 15,000 and 20,000 men, were built around one core strength: elite cavalry. These were not conscripts or temporary fighters. Each man had been trained for years, shaped into a disciplined warrior who could operate as part of a coordinated system rather than as an individual. Their equipment reflected that philosophy. Mamluk cavalry carried composite bows for ranged combat, long lances for shock charges, and curved blades for close fighting. Their armor was layered, quilted padding beneath chainmail or lamellar plates, designed to absorb impact without sacrificing mobility. Even their horses were conditioned for endurance, capable of covering long distances while still maintaining strength in battle. Nothing about them was accidental. Every detail had been refined through constant training and experience. Across the valley, the Mongol army prepared in its own way, equally confident and equally lethal. Though slightly smaller in number, perhaps 10,000 to 12,000, they carried with them something far more powerful than numbers: a legacy of dominance. These were veterans of campaigns that had crushed entire civilizations. They had fought in deserts, mountains, and frozen plains, adapting their tactics to every environment they encountered. Their greatest strength lay in mobility and precision. Mongol horsemen could fire arrows at full gallop with deadly accuracy, striking targets at distances that most armies could barely imagine. They fought in fluid formations, capable of advancing, retreating, and regrouping in moments. Their most feared tactic, the feigned retreat, had destroyed countless enemies who mistook it for weakness. Once an opponent broke formation to pursue, the Mongols would turn, surround, and eliminate them with ruthless efficiency. But what truly set the Mongols apart was not just how they fought, but how they made others feel. Long before the first clash, their reputation had already done half the work. Opponents expected defeat. Commanders doubted their own plans. Soldiers imagined the worst before the battle even began. It was a form of psychological warfare that required no weapons, yet often proved more effective than any blade. And this was exactly what the Mamluks intended to challenge. They had studied the Mongols closely, their patterns, their habits, their assumptions. They knew the rhythm of their attacks, the confidence behind their movements, and the way they manipulated fear to control the battlefield. More importantly, they understood that defeating the Mongols would require more than matching their strength. It would require disrupting that rhythm, breaking that confidence, and turning their own expectations against them. As both armies settled into position, the air grew heavy with anticipation. There were no sudden charges, no reckless advances. Just preparation. Lines were formed, weapons checked, commands quietly passed down through the ranks. Horses shifted beneath their riders, sensing the tension. Men adjusted their grip on reins and weapons, their focus narrowing to the moment ahead. This was the calm before the storm, but it was not empty. It was filled with intention, calculation, and the weight of everything that had come before. Because once the battle began, there would be no room for hesitation. Every movement would matter. Every decision would carry consequences. And somewhere within that quiet, one truth lingered on both sides of the field. By the end of the day, the world would no longer look the same. The morning of September 3, 1260, broke with an uneasy stillness over the valley of Ain Jalut. A thin layer of dust hovered above the ground, stirred by the slow movement of thousands of horses and men taking their positions. Both armies stood within sight of each other now, separated by less than a mile, yet neither side rushed forward. This was not hesitation, it was calculation. The Mamluks formed their lines with deliberate precision. At the front stood light cavalry and skirmishers, flexible and mobile, ready to engage and withdraw. Behind them waited the core of their strength, heavily armed cavalry arranged in tight formation, shields overlapping, lances upright like a wall of steel. Further back, out of immediate sight, reserves remained concealed along the ridges, their presence hidden as part of a larger design. Every position had been chosen for a reason, every movement measured. Across the field, the Mongols mirrored that sense of control, but with a confidence shaped by decades of victory. Their formation stretched in a wide crescent, wings slightly forward, center held back, an arrangement perfected over countless battles. It was a formation built not just to fight, but to manipulate, to draw the enemy in, stretch their lines, and collapse around them when the moment was right. The first movement came not with a charge, but with arrows. A sudden wave of Mongol horse archers advanced at a controlled pace, releasing volleys that cut through the morning air with a sharp, whistling sound. The Mamluks answered almost instantly. Arrows rose from their lines in response, crossing midair before falling into men, shields, and earth. Within moments, the quiet valley was filled with motion, horses shifting, men bracing, the steady rhythm of bowstrings snapping under tension. This was not chaos. It was a test. The Mongols advanced and withdrew in fluid patterns, never fully committing. Small groups rode forward, fired, and peeled away, probing for weakness, searching for a break in discipline. It was a familiar method, one that had dismantled countless armies who mistook these movements for vulnerability. But the Mamluks did not respond as expected. They held. Under the command of Baibars, the front lines absorbed the pressure without overreacting. There was no reckless pursuit, no breaking of formation. Riders resisted the instinct to chase retreating enemies, even when the opportunity seemed obvious. Orders passed quickly through the ranks. Maintain position, conserve energy, wait. It was a subtle but critical difference. To the Mongols, this restraint was unusual. Most armies, faced with their feigned withdrawals, would surge forward, eager to capitalize on what looked like an opening. That moment of eagerness was where the Mongols thrived. But here, that moment never came. The Mamluks responded not with aggression, but with discipline. The exchange continued, stretching longer than expected. Arrows darkened the air in repeated volleys. Horses reared and shifted under the strain. Dust thickened, blurring the edges of the battlefield. Still, neither side committed fully. So the Mongols adjusted. Their attacks grew more aggressive, their probing more deliberate. Units began pressing closer, testing the edges of the Mamluk formation, looking for any sign of collapse. The tempo increased, the pressure mounting with each pass. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Mamluk front began to give ground. At first, it was measured, a step back, then another. Shields remained forward, arrows continued to fly, but the line was moving. To an outside observer, it looked like the beginning of retreat. To the Mongols, it looked like confirmation. The enemy was weakening. What they could not see was that this movement was not a reaction. It was a decision. The Mamluks were not breaking. They were guiding. Step by step, they drew the Mongol forces deeper into the valley, away from open ground and toward the narrowing space between the ridges. Every yard gained by the Mongols brought them closer to a position they did not yet understand. And every moment that passed reinforced their confidence that victory was within reach. From the Mongol perspective, everything was unfolding exactly as it always had. The enemy was giving way. The pressure was working. The outcome felt inevitable. But beneath that surface, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The battle had begun, but the real fight had not yet revealed itself. By midday, The battle had reached a point where everything seemed to confirm what the Mongols had always believed. The Mamluk line was falling back, slowly but consistently, and the valley ahead opened like a path to victory. Dust hung thick in the air, the sound of hooves and bowstrings blending into a constant roar. To Kibuka, this was the moment to finish it, the same pattern he had seen unfold across continents. Pressure the enemy, force them to retreat, then break them completely. So he gave the order to advance. The Mongol center surged forward, their wings stretching outward as they pushed deeper into the narrowing valley. Arrows continued to rain down, but the distance between the two armies was closing rapidly. What had begun as a measured engagement was now turning into something more decisive. From the Mongol perspective, the enemy was on the edge of collapse. But the retreat in front of them was not collapse. It was design. Every step the Mamluks took backward had been calculated. Every movement had drawn the Mongols further away from open ground and deeper into terrain that limited their greatest advantage, mobility. The ridges on either side, quiet and seemingly empty for hours, concealed the final piece of the plan. And then, at the precise moment when the Mongol advance reached its peak, the signal was given. A sharp blast of a war trumpet cut through the chaos. From both sides of the valley, the hidden Mamluk reserves erupted into motion. Thousands of cavalry surged down the slopes at full speed, their formation tight, their timing exact. What had been an open advance just seconds before suddenly became a trap snapping shut. The Mongols had no time to reposition. The first impact was immediate and violent. The Mamluk flanks slammed into the exposed sides of the Mongol force, breaking their formation and disrupting their momentum. Horses collided, men were thrown from their saddles, and the rhythm that had defined Mongol warfare began to fracture. For an army that thrived on control and coordination, even a moment of disruption was dangerous. Here, that disruption became chaos. The valley, once a space for maneuver, now turned into a confined battlefield where movement was restricted and escape routes vanished. Mongol units attempted to pivot, to regroup into smaller defensive circles as they had done in past battles, but the pressure came from every direction. The Mamluks did not chase recklessly, they closed in with discipline, tightening the space, forcing the Mongols inward. At this distance, archery lost its dominance. The battle shifted into brutal close combat. Steel met steel. Lances shattered on impact. Curved blades flashed through dust and sweat as riders clashed at full force. The heavier armor of the Mamluks began to show its advantage, absorbing blows that would have cut down lighter opponents. Their formation held together, even in the chaos, pressing forward as a unified force rather than breaking into isolated fights. In the center of it all, Sultan Kuz made his move. Seeing the Mongol line begin to bend but not yet break, he rode directly into the fight. Removing his helmet so his men could see him, he called them forward, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. It was not just a command, it was a signal. This was the moment everything had been building toward. The Mamluks surged with him. The psychological shift was immediate. What had once been fear now turned into momentum. The Mongols, for the first time in decades of conquest, found themselves not advancing, but reacting. Their confidence, so central to their success, began to falter under the pressure of a battle they could not control. Then came something even more unfamiliar. Amid the clash of weapons and the thunder of hooves, a deep, explosive sound echoed across the valley. Whether crude gunpowder weapons were used to lethal effect or simply as a shock tactic, the result was undeniable. Horses reared, formations hesitated, and for a brief but critical moment, the Mongol response broke its rhythm entirely. The Mamluks seized that moment without hesitation. Their encirclement tightened. The Mongol force, once fluid and unstoppable, was now compressed into a shrinking space with no clear path of escape. Units that had once operated with perfect coordination were reduced to isolated clusters, fighting for survival rather than executing strategy. At the center, Kibuka still stood. He rallied what remained of his forces, fighting with the same determination that had carried him through countless campaigns. Even as the situation collapsed around him, he refused to retreat. His presence held the line together longer than it should have, giving his men a final point of resistance. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. As the Mamluks closed in, Kipoka's horse was brought down beneath him. Surrounded and outnumbered, he continued to fight until he was finally overpowered and captured. Brought before Kipoka, he stood defiant, refusing to kneel, refusing to beg. Moments later, he was executed. With his death, something far greater than a commander was lost. The cohesion of the Mongol force collapsed. The remaining soldiers, still dangerous, still disciplined, began to lose the unity that had defined them. What followed was no longer a battle. It was the final unraveling. For the first time in living memory, the Mongol war machine had been stopped. Not by chance, not by terrain alone, but by a strategy that turned their greatest strengths against them and shattered the illusion that had made them unstoppable. As the dust finally settled over the valley of Ain Jalut, the silence felt almost unreal. Hours earlier, the ground had thundered beneath thousands of hooves, the air thick with arrows, steel, and the raw force of two worlds colliding. Now it was still. The Mongol army, once the embodiment of unstoppable conquest, had collapsed. What remained were scattered survivors fleeing north, carrying with them something far more powerful than defeat: the truth. On that field, the illusion had been broken. The aftermath was not triumph, but exhaustion. The Mamluks did not celebrate wildly. They walked among the fallen in quiet reflection, searching for brothers, tending to the wounded, and burying the dead with solemn respect. The valley that had witnessed chaos just hours before became a place of silence, marked not by victory cries, but by the weight of what it had cost. Yet beyond that silence, the impact began to ripple outward. When news of the battle reached Cairo, disbelief turned into relief, then into something even greater: hope. For the first time in decades, the Mongols had been stopped. Not slowed, not redirected, but decisively defeated. Across the region, the message spread: the unstoppable could be stopped. The myth that had paralyzed entire civilizations was gone. Ain Jalut became more than a battlefield. It became a turning point in history, a reminder that dominance built on fear can be broken by discipline, strategy, and the courage to stand firm when retreat feels inevitable. It was proof that even the most powerful systems have limits, and that understanding your opponent can be more decisive than sheer strength. And maybe that's why this story still matters today. Because whether in war, business, or life, we all face moments where the odds feel overwhelming, where the narrative says you can't win. But Ain Jalut reminds us that those narratives can be rewritten. If you found this story valuable, if it made you think differently about strategy, leadership, or resilience, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this, stories where history reveals lessons we can still use today.